So welcome everyone. My name is Roland Bleiker, and I'd like to welcome you to the third Visual Politics event this year in a series of interviews with authors of recent books on visual politics. And we're particularly pleased today to have with us Professor Jane Lydon from the University of Western Australia. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. This is such a fantastic series.
Well, we're particularly pleased because Jane, you are not only one of Australia's leading historians, but also one of the most prolific and insightful scholars on visual culture. And of course, this is what sort of interests most of us here in particular. Let me give you a little bit of background on Jane. She is the Westpharmer Chair in Australian History at the University of Western Australia. And she has worked across and in fact lived across many aspects of Australia and historical aspects. Jane is originally from Brisbane. She worked as an archaeologist and scholar in Sydney. She lived in Canberra, where she has a PhD from the Australian National University. She worked in Melbourne, where she was an ARC Future Fellow at Monash University and is now the History Chair at the University of Western Australia. Now, Jane's work as a historian looks particularly, among various things, but for us particularly on the visual dimensions of the history, using visual culture, using photography to look at questions of Australia's colonial past, on questions of race, questions of identity, the way in which Indigenous people are depicted, and how all this relates to questions of slavery, human rights, and related issues. It would take too much time to mention all of Jane's various and amazing publications. She is particularly very prolific. So I want to just sort of draw attention to two examples. The book we will be discussing today, Visualising Human Rights, a wonderful book with the University of Western Australia Press, not just insightful, but actually very, very nicely produced as well. And a second one here, the previous one on photography, humanitarianism, and empire. Two absolutely amazing books. And I was wondering, Jane, if you can start a little bit about the background to these books, and the latest one in particular, in the sense that you've had a very, very long interest in visual culture and using visual culture to investigate Australia's colonial past. And can you give us a bit of a sense of what triggered this interest in you, and particularly what then sort of led to your most recent book on visualizing human rights?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for that very kind, very generous introduction. And it's really lovely to be able to talk about some of these ideas and projects with you like this. It's a fairly rare opportunity, actually. But so to come back to your question about how did I develop an interest in visual culture and human rights and associated issues, which is, I suppose, how I think about it. Probably the long-term view, like a lot of us, would be that I sort of entered the workforce during the 1990s at a time when there was a kind of swelling interest in Aboriginal history and culture and experience in Australia. I was very fortunate to work on a museum project, the Museum of Sydney, on the site of First Government House. So as that was being developed and as it opened, I think in 1995, there was a tremendous sense of creativity and bringing a new historical perspective to bear on Australian culture and history. But then I guess I had the opportunity to explore that when I undertook my PhD, my doctoral research at ANU, sort of a few years after that, which was an investigation of the way that Corranderk Aboriginal Station had been represented through photography. So that was a wonderful opportunity, I guess, to explore some of these questions about visuality in relation to a particular very important place. So many people know that Corranderk Aboriginal Station was sited on the edge of Melbourne and was a place of tremendous political activism. So I guess that kind of, it brought me to the realization that although photography could be a tool of imperialism and colonialism, it could also be used by Indigenous people themselves, conversely, as a means of activism and subverting those kinds of relationships and those power imbalances. So I guess that was really where I began to develop an interest in those sorts of very grounded and embodied politics using photography.
Well, there's a lot of sort of fascinating issues you've already brought up in terms of the relationship between photography and sort of domination, colonialism on the one hand, but also photography as a form of resistance, as a form of kind of promoting social change and rights. But I was wondering, before we get into these kind of substantive topics, one thing that interests me in particular is sort of the genre of writing that you use to engage these issues, in the sense that your most recent book is an edited book and the previous book is an authored book. So two sort of different genres. And can you give us a bit of a sense from your experience about the advantages and disadvantages of the genres, what you can achieve with an edited book, what you can achieve with an authored book, how they kind of relate in terms of how you want to get across as a historian, as a scholar of visual culture, how you want to get across your ideas in these different genres?
Yeah, that is such a key question, really. For me, and of course there'll be many different views about this, but editing was an opportunity to collaborate, but at the same time, you're sort of giving up control, and there's a lot of effort that goes into perhaps managing a project and working with other people and managing other people in a sense. Specifically, the Visualising Human Rights edited collection came out of a research project that was funded by the ASC, was led by my colleague, the historian Fiona Paisley, and it was aiming to explore the role of anti-slavery culture and rhetoric in Australia. So it was about, the way that a language and imagery derived from the anti-slavery movement in Britain was then applied in particular contexts in Australia. So part of that that project, or one of its outcomes, was to stimulate an interest in the way that human rights then drew from that much earlier historical discourse. And we held a conference here in Perth, and that then evolved into the book. So some of the questions that animated that project were then, again, how is this visual language used in Australia to perhaps present ideals of human rights, or to communicate ideas around, the apparatus of human rights, which of course only emerged after World War II in a formal way, but also how those ideas challenged and subverted visually. So to come back to this question about the different genres, I think there's a tremendous sort of privilege in writing your own book and a monograph, and you have control and the luxury to explore ideas from your own perspective. Whereas with editing, there's a lot of reminding people about deadlines. I know that publishers prefer a kind of consistency or a coherence, that they wish you to bring to a project as an editor. Whereas perhaps I'd also say that as a scholar and a reader, I enjoy the diversity and the breadth that an editing project brings to a particular topic. So, yeah, I guess there are pros and cons with editing, as with everything else. There's the pleasure of collaboration, the diversity, the breadth, the way that you can cover, a topic by looking at different periods and examples and places, different political moments. But then, of course, there's that sense of persuading people to fall into line or not, and of course dealing with quite different responses.
Look, that in some senses it gets us very nicely to one of the sort of issues, the first sort of question I had about the substance of your book, and that's the whole notion of communicating across difference. You know, it's speaking of different voices in the book, but of course, photography in many ways is also about communicating across difference, and that can be difference in space, in the sense that we often, you know, we find out today about events in the world through visual representations, whether it's terrorist attacks or you know, diplomatic events. We don't witness them personally, we find out about them through visual representations. Same, of course, about past events. You know, we often find out about historical events through photographs, through films, through other visual documentation. So many sort of have argued that this then creates a certain bond among people. This sort of these visual circulation of visual data creates certain bonds. But you have, I think, convincingly argued in both of your books, and in the previous one particularly, that the visual, in that sense, visual culture is also parts of a form of domination, a form of imperialism, a form of colonialism. So I was wondering if you can outline a bit what you kind of discovered as a historian, what manifestation that this took, these links between the visual and the imperial.
Absolutely. So it's very clear, you know, we have a vast body of scholarship now that has shown the implication of photography and other visual media in the process of imperialism. So images have been used to justify, you know, processes such as governance, by showing Indigenous people as primitive, as somehow lower or inferior to white Europeans. And, you know, we can see that, I guess, very clearly when we look at these imperial texts. But then I think what's fascinating, something that really fascinated me from very early on, is the way that visual meaning, it's so strongly framed by its context, whether that's textual or simply the way that it's enmeshed in particular circumstances and relationships. So the same photograph that is shown, for example, during the 1860s at one of the international exhibitions to show that the Kulin Nations people of Korondurk were inferior, now simply transcends that very limited and oppressive context to assume the status of a dignified family portrait. So descendants will now take that very same photograph of a person and point to the way that it kind of swells beyond that very limited historical frame. So I think quite frequently when we look at these historical photographs, simply, you know, due to the fact that our own context and our own sense of visual culture has changed, we often don't see what it was that the original photographer wanted us to see. We often see something quite different. And so in that way, I think the visual image really, you know, the visual meaning is very much determined contextually. So I think that points to the limits of visual meaning, you know, and people have often argued that images can't change our mind. But at the same time, sometimes those images do assume fresh power. So again, that very portrait of a historical person, you know, we now read the signs of scarification to see that perhaps that person had been initiated. We see signs of culture, material culture, but also signs of change and adaptation. So there's a whole biography that really emerges from that portrait that challenges the photographer's original intention. So it's really quite fascinating, you know, that the way that visual meaning is determined and shaped. And I think that historical perspective can often show that, you know, reveal that to us in a way that is harder when we're looking at images and politics in our own time.
Can you say maybe a few words about how that relates to the key topic of your recent book about visualizing human rights, in the sense that sort of one of the sort of key arguments in the literature, thinking of Susie Linfield and others, is that we often sort of visualize human rights through a violation of human rights. You know, the media is often focused on violence, on violent events, on negative events. So when the visual triggers human rights, it's by visualizing of genocides, of a range of human rights violations. Is there, I mean, can you say a few words about that, but also perhaps to what extent we might be able to actually visualize human rights in a more positive way? Is that possible, or is the negative implicated? How did your research sort of deal with these issues?
Yeah, I think that's quite a troubling question, because it is often stated, both of the visual record, but also in other contexts, that we can only imagine rights through their violation, as you say. But then again, from a historical perspective, if we look at that moment when the apparatus of human rights was formally proclaimed with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the end of World War II, we see photography taken up as a medium, a visual medium that can supposedly transcend borders of time, space, culture, language. So UNESCO harnessed photography in a number of projects, as did the other Western cultural institutions. So we think of the Family of Man, that blockbuster exhibition that travelled the world, that was curated by Steichen at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but also a project that UNESCO produced, which was designed to share the results of, or to share this new concept of human rights with people around the world. And what I find fascinating about those projects is that they're trying to convey the idea of human rights visually through this sort of harmonious family of man kind of model. So, you know, and immediately I think we run into some of these problems with the idea of human rights itself, as this kind of, you know, which is, of course, the critique of liberalism and a kind of bourgeois liberalism. So we remember the Family of Man, for example, through Barth's famous critique. You know, this idea that a universalizing human family faces difference and inequalities in a very unhelpful way. But at the same time, we see UNESCO bringing together this idea of, you know, a family, a sort of harmonious kind of human family, alongside a counter-narrative of what it called struggle. So in the UNESCO album, which is designed to sort of share this new idea of human rights, we see images of war dead, for example, so bodies lying on beaches, images from the liberated concentration camps in Europe, alongside these more harmonious familial images of like literally families sitting around a table eating their evening meal. So I think that's quite an interesting experiment that we see at the moment, that human rights and the declaration is proclaimed in the 1940s. And then more recently, as you say, these images are dominated by atrocity and images of trauma, in fact, that create emotions, but which have also been problematized in particular ways and shown to be quite limited sort of narratives. So I think there are different ways we can see that. One is to note that these are often very extreme examples. So these show moments of trauma, like in the humanitarian crisis, of course, we all think of the image of Aylan Kurdi, a little boy washed up on a beach in Turkey. And one of the criticisms of those sorts of victim-oriented images is that it doesn't show us the underlying problems and the way that human rights are violated in more systemic ways.
You make some fascinating points there about sort of the way in which visual culture is inevitably linked to dominant ways of representing the world, dominant discourses, you know, sometimes good discourses, like with good intentions, with humanitarian intentions, but nevertheless, they inevitably part of a prevailing discourse. So, and the two things when you talked about sort of popped up to me, which I thought might be interesting to look a bit in more detail. One is the notion of sort of emotions and affect, which I think your new book sort of tackles in more detail, but also, and to come back to something we've talked about early on, is what kind of counter strategies exist? To what extent can we develop counter strategies? For instance, Indigenous people, counter strategies to kind of use the visual to go beyond these dominant visual narratives and to find different ways of predicting the world. What are the limits and the potentials, and to what extent does affect and emotions come into these strategies between visual and dominant visuals and sort of resistant visuals, if you want?
Absolutely. So I think I have been fascinated by that idea for a very long time, and particularly the notion of empathy. So empathy is, of course, we now use it everywhere. So it's used by scholars in particular disciplines, and as well as in a very common sense way. In fact, in Australia, of course, we've recently had a controversy around gender politics, where various politicians and parliamentarians have been, it's been suggested they need to have empathy training, and whereas others have said, well, you know, what good is that? Does that work? And so forth. But I think that, so the concept of empathy really only made its way into the English language in the early 20th century. So it's a very recent concept. And when we talk about emotions prior to that, so compassion, fellow feeling, sympathy, of course, to refer to sort of group those under the term empathy is in a sense anachronistic. However, it's also provided a fantastic vehicle for debating the kind of relationships that we're talking about when we talk about images. So I have found that that notion of empathy, you know, a certain degree of identification with the person being represented visually, a very useful one in my work. And if we sort of extend that back into the historical period, the colonial period in the 19th century, for example, we can see these sorts of emotions aroused by images operating very powerfully. And I think generally they reinforce those relations of inequality, where we have the, you know, a representation that enables the Western viewer from looking from a position of comfort and privilege to feel sorry for that person who is often Black or non-white at a distance. So there's often, you know, a sense in which the image is the means of understanding the plight of that person, and it's usually their plight. So again, people depicted in an extreme way. And I think a wonderful historical example of that comes from the British abolitionist movement is, of course, Wedgwood's medallion, which was the logo of the anti-slavery movement. So you have the kneeling, shackled slave, the Black man sort of pleading with the white viewer, and the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So I think that many scholars have argued that this actually evokes that sense of the benevolent white viewer and the pleading passive object of concern, you know, the Black slave in that case. But I think that's a dynamic that we continue to see right up and into the present, as many have pointed out. So Lily Chuliaraki's work, your own work, I think, for example, has emphasised this very difficult, you know, the difficulty with these kinds of strategies. So then to bring it back to the book that we're talking about and the many contributors. So, you know, I hasten to emphasise that I'm just the editor, but among the contributors, I think some of the chapters directly address this question. For example, Suvendrini Pereira and Joseph Pugliese, they address this question of representation and the problem with these humanitarian discourses very directly. They draw from Nancy's theory of incompletion, and they try and find a way of subverting these mainstream dominant kinds of visual strategies by making their own film. So drawing from their project, which is exploring Black sites, they make a film in which a series of people, citizens, call the Australian government to account for its policies with respect to refugees. So in doing that, they're seeking to challenge and to produce a new kind of visual strategy. But I think other contributors, such as Brenda Croft, so Brenda's image is actually on the cover. So this is, again, taken from the archive, and it's a photograph of her grandmother. Her father was removed under assimilation policies that we now call the stolen generations. And because her grandmother was of part Chinese descent, Brenda, as an artist and, you know, researching her family history, found this image, and it was part of the sort of racial classification of Aboriginal people in ways that we now find quite abhorrent. So she was termed half caste, part Chinese, and so forth. And so what Brenda has done as an artist is to take that image and then stamp these categories across it to draw our attention to the human being, I suppose, who was enmeshed in those punitive policies. So her contribution to the collection is actually a photo essay that draws from this journey of rediscovery, where she's trying to piece together these fragments from her family tree and reconnect those family relationships and links to place, of course, that are so foundational for Aboriginal people. So I think it's a very powerful image, actually, that we used on the cover. And I just mentioned very briefly, another contribution to the book by Mary Tomich explores those strategies of visualising refugees, I think in very nuanced ways. And I think some of and what she does is look at social media. So she's looking at these stories such as the Instagram hashtag I was a refugee. And she pulls out images, for example, just looking for that here, that were contributed by Alicia Fernando, who contrasted an image of herself as a baby asleep on board the ship where her family had been rescued as they fled Vietnam, which was taken in 1982. And Alicia Fernando contrasts that early image with images of herself and her family as Australian citizens. So, you know, decades later, they have studied, they have worked, they've contributed to Australia, and they're now very, you know, productive, settled citizens who are contributing to Australian society. And of course, some of these images show her with the captain of the ship that rescued them. So again, alluding back to that moment where they were helped and supported and absorbed into the Australian population. So I think that's very powerful as well when we see refugees start to take control of their own representation and tell their own stories. And that, I think, transcends those relationships of inequality that we do see in mainstream media.
There's so many issues there that I know many of us here have a key interest in, you know, the issue of Indigenous politics, the issue of refugees, of humanitarian responsibilities, how questions of affect and emotions are linked to the visual circulation of information, how that links to power and to politics. And I have at least, I think, 10 questions more noted down here, but I was wondering if at this stage we might want to wrap this part up and then sort of go on to open it up for everyone here present to come in for a broader discussion on the issues at stake. So for now, big thanks, Jane, and we'll go to the informal discussion now.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.